Ah, the Mabinogi. Many people have opinions, but beware, there are also facts. So this is a fairly light-hearted, but hopefully entirely factual look at what the Mabinogi is and what it isn't. Here are some true or false statements. See how many of these you can get right. True or false? The word Mabinogian is wrong. The proper word is Mabinogi. It depends on what you're talking about. Mabinogi refers to the 4 branches of the Mabinogi, a cycle of 4 episodic stories which are loosely connected. A funny little sentence found at the end of each branch helps us understand why they're called branches. Here ends this branch of the Mabinogi. Now, these 4 stories are found in 2 manuscripts, the Red Book of Hergest and the White Book of Hrithric. They're found with a collection of another 6 or 7 stories, one more in the Red Book than the White. These other stories have different characteristics, but altogether they make a nice collection. When translators started putting these stories into English, they ran afoul of something they really should have understood, but they didn't. One of these little ending phrases, there are 8 altogether, 4 branches, 2 manuscripts. One of them in the White Book says Mabinogian instead of Mabinogi. The early translators thought this was a plural of Mabinogi, but it isn't. Mabinogi is already plural, and that single instance of Mabinogian was just an error on the part of the scribe, because there was a word ending in yon in the line above. The result was that when this collection of 11 tales was published in English, it got published under the title The Mabinogion. Charlotte Guest often gets blamed for this, but she didn't start it. William Owen Pugh gets the credit, or blame for that. But Guest's translation was very popular, a real bestseller for decades, by which time the 11 stories had become widely known as the Mabinogion. So the name stuck, and it's accepted today as the clearest way to refer to the wider collection of 11 or sometimes 12 stories, 12 because Guest also included Taliesin, which comes from a different source. But Mabinogian is not correct when referring just to the 4 branches. They should definitely be called the Mabinogi. So when talking about the 4 branches, Mabinogian is wrong, but it's fine to use it when talking about the wider set of stories. True or false? The Mabinogi is fantasy. I don't think we can really call it that. However the scribes and readers of the 4 branches thought about these stories when they were produced, it's a stretch to say that the fantasy genre existed yet. But the genre of creating literary versions of old stories, stories that might be a mix of myth and folklore, that was becoming popular. These stories aren't so much made up as patched up and given a fresh coat of paint. People probably just thought of that as good storytelling. Many fantasy novels and such have been inspired by the Mabinogi. They certainly influenced Tolkien, for example. And an American author called Evangeline Walton wrote a series of fantasy novels based on the Mabinogi, but they stray quite far from the originals, and I don't really recommend them, especially if you're trying to get a sense of the characters as deities. Walton is too misleading. It's also worth remembering that the Mabinogi is important culturally to the people of Wales. It's a literary treasure that's part of their national identity and ancient past. As such, it should be treated with a certain respect. Basing new works on it is usually fine, but it needs to be done with sensitivity and without misrepresenting the originals. So that one's false. It's not fantasy. If you're enjoying this series, why not take one of my online classes? There's almost always something on offer. Some classes have tiered pay-what-you-can pricing, and there are usually a few scholarships available for the more expensive classes. To get notifications about classes and about scholarships when they're announced, you can go to my website and subscribe to my newsletter, or follow me on my Patreon page. True or false? The Mabinogi is an ancient Celtic myth. The origin of the Mabinogi is definitely shrouded in mystery, and that also is true of ancient myths. But at the same time, the Mabinogi is medieval literature. It definitely contains echoes of older stories, which probably go back to genuine Celtic myths. But the Mabinogi in the form it exists today only goes back to perhaps the 11th century. The version in the two manuscripts both appear to be copies of a lost original, and the literary experts feel sure that this version had a single author. How much that author changed the forms is anybody's guess, because no previous forms have really survived. There are references to some of the stories and some of the four-branch characters in other Welsh literature, like the Triads of Britain. From these references, we can tell that there were other versions of some of the four branches' stories. However, there are no references at all to most of the first branch. At the same time, there are several clear parallels with stories from Ireland, and some characters have names cognate with figures from Irish texts or inscriptions to deities in Gaul. So we can be sure that at least some of the stories were once stories of Celtic deities, in other words, myths. So there's a tiny bit of truth in this, but not really that much. True or false, the Mabinogi is Christian propaganda. It's always mentioning God. There are lots of mentions of God in the Mabinogi, if you include what's essentially swearing, yes. Should we take that as religious speech? Probably not. In general, devout Christians don't go around swearing things to God, because when the Bible says don't take the Lord's name in vain, that's what it's talking about. That's why we have polite versions of swearing even today. By golly fills in for by God, and we say crikey because you're not supposed to say Christ as an exclamation. But that's precisely what the characters in the Mabinogi are doing. They're swearing, presumably because that's what people did on a daily basis, and the scribes who copied the stories apparently didn't mind. Other than that, there's no real mention of Christianity in the stories. People are sometimes concerned with right and wrong, but there's no mention of sin or religion. So I'd say that one is totally false. I hope you got a good score on this little quiz. If not, you're bound to do better next time.